A suspected Chinese surveillance balloon was shot down above U.S. territory, which is thought to be part of a larger fleet traveling from 5 different continents, according to U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He adds that the U.S. had shared information gathered from the balloon debris with dozens of other countries. The U.S. has since blacklisted 6 Chinese entities it said were linked to Beijing's aerospace programs as part of a retaliation. To understand this further, we're joined now by Spector, Daily Maverick's Associate Editor. And I didn't know, Brooks, a former U.S. ambassador, so you are exceptionally well placed to help us unpack this. A balloon causing so much international sort of distress and anxiety, angst, you could say. What on earth is going on?
Well, good morning. It's good to be with you. Let me just correct that. Not an ambassador, but a diplomat, retired. You only get one ambassador to a country, so I was part of a larger staff. But the balloons we're talking about are not the kinds of things you might see at Disney World or a carnival or Thanksgiving Day parade. These are very high-tech constructions that have some power of independent motion direction control, and we're flying, if we know the numbers correctly, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 60,000 feet above ground, which translates into what, 15 to 20,000 meters above the surface of the Earth. The challenge is that although many countries now operate reconnaissance or, if you want, espionage or spy satellites, the satellites are above the limits of normal manned flight for airplanes, and so the general understanding internationally is that a satellite is effectively immune to claims of sovereignty and the protection of sovereign airspace. A balloon, on the other hand, because it relies on the air for its mobility, for its ability to stay aloft, is in fact at the outer reaches of commercial air flight and has the capacity, therefore, to obstruct international commercial air travel, and is generally seen as an effort to violate a country's airspace and thus its carrying out of espionage or reconnaissance or spying activities. And so in recent days, there have been at least 4 of these balloons over the United States, Canada, and in one case, Central and South America. And in all cases, they apparently have undercarriages which, depending on which one it was, somewhere between the size of a Volkswagen and 3 buses. 3 buses is a little bit more than a weather balloon, because lots of countries use weather balloons, and the package of materials that track the data is really small and compact. I mean, it would fit on your kitchen table almost. This, by contrast, is a sophisticated effort. They have solar panel arrays. They have ability to listen in on communications data, cell phone data, radio transmissions. And the presumption is that they are an active effort at espionage, or they are testing the ability of nations, in this case the U.S. and Canada, to monitor and deal with violations of airspace. I think testing is something we need to be particularly aware of, yes.
Thank you, and thanks too for that correction. I suppose as a diplomat, even if not the ambassador, you still understand the sort of details of how a state would really deal with something like this and the fallout that can follow. You've mentioned those countries where these balloons have been detected. No mention of any airspace in the African continent. Is that possibly because there's simply not the sort of means to detect balloons, or are you confident that there aren't such balloons flying over African airspace?
Well, I'm not confident there are none, but if you just a quick look at a globe or a map tells you that it is more difficult, not impossible obviously, but more difficult for such devices, if they were to leave, say, China or Russia, if they follow the air currents and the jet stream and the general direction of weather patterns, they would fly across the northern hemisphere. To get something like that launched into the southern hemisphere becomes more problematic, especially in a continent like Africa, which is about as far from the northern countries as you can range and still be a landmass, unless you're talking Antarctica. So it is entirely possible, but it is much less likely because the concentration of information to detect is also less rich. The first one that was detected and shot down off the coast of South Carolina last week, the plot of it shows it streaming over radar emplacements in northern Alaska and then parts of Canada, but then importantly over a whole series of military and defense installations in the Rocky Mountain states of the U.S., and then areas in the eastern seaboard, which are rich with military installations and therefore military traffic. But I think that, to me at least, the key is not so much the ability to spy on such facilities, because satellites can do that already. And satellites, as we know from the war in Ukraine, even the data that's available without military capabilities, the common use data that we can see, can detect information that's really quite detailed and in some cases very small. But it's the idea that the country or countries launching these balloons are testing the capabilities of the countries affected to monitor, to notice, and to ultimately to destroy them. And I think that's kind of what's happening.
I mean, China has said the balloon is benign, that it was doing weather surveillance. You've mentioned those key sites. The one in the U.S. has flown over, which perhaps points otherwise. But I guess the question now is what happens with the debris. The U.S. are clearly looking at it and what they can glean from analyzing what has now fallen from the heavens. But there's a almost diplomatic dispute now on what happens with what remains of the balloon.
Well, if like me, you're fascinated by the way countries can reconstruct the reasons why aircraft meet calamitous ends and fall out of the sky, the debris field is, the plane doesn't usually just land in one piece. All manner of pieces are scattered in all kinds of places and are put together slowly and painstakingly to develop a profile and ultimately an explanation. And I think that if the material that is found off the coast of South Carolina, and I remember they waited till it was over water rather than have it hit hard ground and scatter and shatter in all manner of ways. The ocean would have been a little bit easier. Once they pull that out of the ocean and they reconstruct to some degree, they're going to be able to determine what exactly its capabilities were and possibly what information it was able to glean. There's always the question, and I don't think anybody is going to tell us directly how the countermeasures against its capabilities were waged, or whether or not its ability to obtain electronic data was blocked in some way, shape, or form. That's above all of our pay grades right about now. But I think it's probably pretty clear that once they have all the pieces they can get from the various of these balloons, they're going to be able to develop a fairly complex picture of what the capabilities were and just how much of a coverage of the country was obtained this way. And remember, too, and the information only came out recently, that in the previous 5 or 6 years, there have been at least 3 other such balloons that were monitored but never attacked, or no efforts were made to bring them down. I think part of that was bureaucratic inertia. You don't want to believe that something is part of a much larger pattern until it is. And then you begin to realize just exactly what we're looking at.
Yes, Blinken saying, for example, that the U.S. has been targeted in a broader program, him saying this violates the sovereignty of not only the U.S. but countries across 5 continents. You've spoken about those. The NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg also commenting on it. And now the issue of sovereignty coming up, Blinken drawing parallels with what's been happening in Ukraine. You've mentioned satellite monitoring there. And then, of course, Biden himself, who said, if I can just get to it, make no mistake about it, as we made clear last week, if China threatens our sovereignty, there the word is again, we will act to protect our country. And we did. I mean, this kind of messaging around these surveillance balloons really sort of showing almost kind of Cold War tones. You know, are we kind of seeing this sort of publicized in a way to sort of keep that line clear, you know, following on from Ukraine, that we're in a kind of second Cold War of sorts?
Well, I hesitate to use the phrase Cold War because it has all kinds of ramifications and images that come to the fore, and the possibility of fingers, you know, inching their way toward that awful red button, but not quite ever getting there. But this is, I think, part of a larger effort between, and I'm not ascribing a particular direction in this, between China and the United States, a question of competition and the potential for dominance in various industrial and technological areas, and an effort to maintain and to monitor and to gain information that would or could be useful in such circumstances. The fact that the U.S. has now taken steps against a number of Chinese companies that are assumed to have, although they're separate companies, major links with the Chinese military establishment in supplying technology, says that the tension is clearly getting stronger, higher, deeper than it was. I'm not sure what the word is right now for this. But by the same token, there's still enormous volumes of trade between the two countries, as well as businesses invested on both sides of the divide. But part of it too, and we must sort of bring this one in just to keep it in mind. There is one element of the tension between the two countries which is not resolvable easily, and that, of course, is the status and circumstances of Taiwan, the island that's off the coast of China, but is presumed to be an independent nation and acts that way. And the Chinese claim that it is not an independent nation and is an integral part of China. To the extent the U.S. supports Taiwan is the extent to which that's a tension that doesn't go away regardless of any other massages.
Well, this has been incredibly helpful in terms of making sense of why a balloon has been causing such an outcry, and certainly sounds like some very serious themes at play. Spector there, Daily Maverick's Associate Editor and former U.S. diplomat. Thank you for your time.